Start again. All right, so what I'm going to do now is what I call Martin's rules of Martin's rules of philosophy. That's me. That's Martin. That's my name, Martin. So you should call me Dr. Young or Dark Master. That will work too. And if you cringe when you're talking to me, that's usually well. So I'm going to start at the bottom of the rules with the more important ones, and just try to cover as many as I can between now and 9:40. So between now and 9:40, we're going to cover as many of these rules as we can. And it's going to start with Rule 22, the rule of magic, which is much less cool than it sounds. And it's a great name, but the rule is going to be really boring and depressing, because there is no such thing as magic. There's no such thing as magic. Which is a real shame, because if there was such a thing as magic, I would be really, really good at it. So this annoys me. Nothing else. Well, what I mean by no such thing of magic, well, if someone tells you that X causes Y, X will make Y happen, and I say, can you prove that? Can you show me an X and a Y and bring in an X and then Y happens? And they say no. And they say, well, can you explain how X makes Y happen? And they say no. It just does. Well, that's kind of the end of the conversation if philosophy is involved, because there's no reason to think that X does Y. X makes Y happen. Later in the semester, we're going to talk about René Descartes' theory of mind and body. And René Descartes famously claimed that mind, your mind, the thinky bit that you have, has no properties in common with body. That's your body, right? Your physical bit, right? So you got and mind is completely immaterial. It's not made of matter or mass energy or anything else. It has nothing to do with arrangements of matter. It's a completely different substance. It's a completely different thing, and that it can kind of wander off. And it doesn't have to be attached to the body, and the body can die and the mind goes off and does, I don't know what it would do without a body. I think it would go off and be like really bored. It's like, oh, I used to have a body, I could do stuff. Now I just sit and look. Kind of a sad story, actually. But anyway, so Descartes says mind has no properties with body. And then people say, well, how do mind and body interact then? Right? If mind has no properties with body, if mind is not physical and body is only physical, how did they can't affect each other? And that was used to be called the mind-body problem. That how does Descartes' idea of mind, how does mind, as Descartes conceives it, interact with body as Descartes conceives it? Because, right, if we think that the mind is made by the body, that the mind is really a physical thing made by the body by manipulating electrons and synapses and things like that, no problem. Matter affects matter. But how does matter affect something that can't be affected by matter? And so Descartes' theory comes crashing down. And then along comes these Charlies, and they say, well, that's kind of naive, because that assumes that causality requires impact, that something has to touch something else. And it could be a more ethereal kind of causality. Well, there's a problem with this. What is ethereal causality? Well, ethereal causality would be causality affecting the ether, which is a discredited physical theory, which is, but, you know, well, they mean maybe esoteric or weird kind of causality. We'll use the word ethereal causality. So, we won't worry about where the word came from, we're just using it. Okay, so suppose I'm someone who says Descartes' theory is not proved wrong because it could be ethereal causality where the mind interacts with the body. And you can ask, well, what's ethereal causality? And I say, well, it's the way the mind interacts with the body. And how does that work? Well, by ethereal causality. Well, what is ethereal causality? It's the kind of causality where an immaterial mind interacts with a material body. Well, isn't that impossible? No, because there could be ethereal causality. Right. And after a while, you begin to realize that the term ethereal causality basically is the same as saying it just does. How do fairies make people fall asleep? Well, they just do. They have the power. They have the magic power to do this. And that kind of reasoning doesn't work anywhere. Think about trying to do this kind of reasoning in science. You want to explain nuclear fusion. How does it work? Well, it's ethereal causality. Can you demonstrate that it happens? The question to ask someone who talks about ethereal causality is, can you give an example? What would be an example of ethereal causality? Apart from this mind-body business, give me an uncontroversial example of ethereal causality in action. And yeah, I'm as confused as you are. Because I've never heard of an uncontroversial. I mean, I know a lot of physics. I know how physics is done. Well, I'm going to say, no, I don't understand it. Right? I don't understand the Higgs boson. It gives mass by being dragged through a field. What? No. But I know that you can test for its existence. They just did last year with the Large Hadron Collider. They did experiments that would only work, that worked a way that they could only work if the Higgs boson existed. If the Higgs boson didn't exist, they wouldn't have got the results they did. But you can't do that for ethereal causality. You can't tell me how what an instance of ethereal causality would be like for an observer who was watching it happen. So it's a meaningless term. It's a term, well, it means the same as magic. It does it by magic. And there's no magic in philosophy, because if you say it does it by magic, you're just saying, well, it just does it. We have no reason to think it does. Did that make sense to anyone? You notice I say, did it make sense to... No, I didn't ask, does it make sense to everyone? I'm asking, does it make sense to anyone? If I got through to half of you, if I got it across. All right, so I'm going to go to the next rule, which is the rule of assumptions. It's kind of a related rule. Oh, damn, I'm absent a vital piece of equipment. I do not have a coffee cup. So, yeah, pretty good. But I've got an old ginger beer bottle. It's non-alcoholic. At least it was when I opened it. So I've got this empty ginger beer bottle. All right, I occasionally have conversations with people about various things, and once in a while it's about religion. And every so often somebody will say, well, God must exist to explain the universe. And I say, well, how does God explain the universe? Well, we just have to assume that God has the power to create universes, and then God explains the existence of the universe. And I go, well, you know, you don't have to, okay, so you say that you can assume that your designated entity, God, has the power to create universes. Okay, in that case, I can assume that my empty ginger beer bottle has that power too. Because if you can make that assumption about something whose existence you can't even demonstrate, you know, because, well, let's assume God exists, and we'll assume God has this power. Okay, well, we don't have to assume the ginger beer bottle. We don't have to assume the bottle exists. Look, here it is. I could throw it at you if you like. No, no one would like that. But so I make one less assumption. I just assume that this thing has the power to create universes. Well, it created this one backwards in time, which is pretty cool because it didn't even exist then. It's a really powerful ginger beer. That's awesome, isn't it? Right. So if you are in a conversation with someone and they make an assumption about their side, well, you can make the same kind of assumption about your side. And if their argument collapses when you make your assumption, that means their argument was never any good. Did that make sense? Right. You've got to watch assumptions. People assume all kinds of things. But if they can make an assumption, you can make an assumption. If I can make an assumption, everybody else can make a similar kind of assumption and bring it into the mix. So, the rule of explanation. All right, this is kind of a tricky one. It's sort of borrowed from science. If I'm offering an explanation, right, I'm offering my ginger beer bottle explains the universe, right? So, well, you can ask, you know, how? What is it about the ginger beer bottle that explains the universe? And if I say, well, it just does, okay, you know, magic. Can't really assume that kind of thing. This goes into. Do you remember? Anybody ever hear of the original four elements of Empedocles? It was like 3,000 years ago. There was a guy called Empedocles who came up with this idea of four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And he claimed that all matter was every bit of matter was some combination of these four elements, right? And that was the dominant theory in Western culture for a couple thousand years. Which is really strange because around the same time as Empedocles came up with this, two guys, Leucippus and Democritus, came up with something called atomic theory. Atomic theory is about 3,000 years old. And their idea was that these little things called atoms that would float around in the void and hook onto each other, and when they hooked onto each other, enough of them hooked on, you'd get big things like bottles and hats and people. Right? And their idea was everything is made of atoms, and there are different kinds of atoms that combine in different ways. Now, what theory does modern science accept? The four elements of Empedocles or the atomic theory of Leucippus and Democritus? Atomic theory. It's not exactly the same theory that Leucippus and Democritus came up with, but it does involve atoms. How many elements are there, roughly? In atomic theory, how many elements do we have? What's an element?
At least like 100.
Yeah, it's like 118,
Yeah.
at least according to Wikipedia. I looked it up. So let's, there's over 100 elements. Oh, you know the technical definition of an atom? If I take a block of a pure substance, say sulfur, right? Not a compound, but a pure element, like sulfur or nickel or molybdenum iron, and I cut it in half and throw away half, cut the remainder in half and throw away half, keep cutting. Eventually I come to something I can't cut without changing its nature. That is, I get to a bit of iron that if I broke this up, I wouldn't have iron anymore. Right? And if you take an atom of iron and break it up, then you have neutrons, protons, and electrons floating around. And then the neutrons break up, they fizz off, they die, vaporize. But you would have just subatomic particles. And every atom has, almost every atom has neutrons, all of them have protons, and they all have electrons running around, unless they're like hydrogen ion, which I think is one proton. Anyway, but you see, you've got all these subatomic particles, and they can be combined in different ways to make elements. And because we have this understanding, we have this theory, and it has a mathematical, it's laid out mathematically, we can calculate and predict the properties of various substances. They've predicted the existence of elements that we haven't seen yet. Right? And they can predict their properties because of what they know about the number of neutrons, protons, and electrons they would have. Right? You know about uranium-type elements, thorium, neptunium, I think, there's plutonium and uranium, right?
Unstable elements?
Right, yeah, right. They're unstable, right? There are these elements that are called transuranics, which are bigger than the uranium kind of, the uranic atoms. So they'd be like huge. And the ones they've made so far have very short half-lives. They vaporize right away, boom. But the idea is that if we could make even heavier transuranics, eventually we get to some that'll be stable and they'll stick around. And they'll be like really, really heavy. You can make really, really heavy things. So you could do things like make a golf ball around some transuranic. It's not radioactive, but you make a golf ball around it, and you'd have to bring like a crane in and you put it on a golf course. And then you could say to someone, "Get my ball." And they go and they try to pick it up and then, ow! Right? Like that. Okay, it's a really expensive practical joke, but it'd probably be worth it, because it'd be really cool. Unless it sank down to the center of the earth, because I'm not sure, it might be too heavy to even be supported by the average fairway. Okay, I'm still working out the details of this prank. So an explanation must actually explain. It's got, you can't, and if you look at something like intelligent design and say, well, the claim is, and it's false by the way, the claim is that evolution can't explain the bacterial flagellum, which is false because evolution actually does have an explanation for it. But let's say it's true that the evolution cannot explain the flagellum. And you say, well, here's my explanation. An intelligent designer designed it and then built it and installed it in bacteria, and then they organized the DNA of the bacteria so they would make more flagella and bacterial flagella. Look! Well, okay, so how did the intelligent designer do it? No, seriously, how did he do it? Because if it's going to be an explanation, we want to know how he did it. How did it happen? What was his first step? What machinery did he? Did he have like really tiny tweezers? Like I don't know. How would you manipulate DNA? Like I don't know. But how did the intelligent designer do it? Magic. And again, related rule: no such thing as magic. So if someone offers an argument in philosophy that purports to rest on an explanation, it's actually got to be an explanation. I've got too many colors. Oh, I guess black. Universality. That's the word. Rule of universality. This is a fundamentally important rule. The rules of logic are universal. Now, it's often the case that we're not entirely sure what the rules of logic are. Logic as a field of study has been going for several thousand years. Well, 2,000. You know, we've been working the rules out since then, and there's still people working on logic. And in a discussion in a philosophy classroom, well, I teach logic, but even I don't know what all the real rules of logic are, or all the real rules of ethics, of morality are, and they could be arguable. But one thing we do know about logic, rock solid, is that the rules of logic, whatever they are universal. Which means that if something really is a rule of logic, it's a rule everywhere, in every instance to which it can be applied. And to illustrate this, I once got into an argument with a fellow who insisted that abortion is morally wrong because it interrupts a natural process. And I said, okay, so you're saying it's wrong to interrupt a natural process? And he says, yes. So if you're in a car accident and one of your major arteries is severed, and the paramedics come along and they want to slap a dressing on that to stop the bleeding, they would be wrong to do so because they would be interrupting the natural process of you bleeding to death. At which point he said, oh, you're comparing apples to oranges, and stormed off. Which was the perfect end to that conversation, because he went away. It's funny. Oh, well. It's some advantage of logic. I mean, you can have so much fun with logic. Anyway. But, you know, if it's wrong to interrupt a natural process, it's wrong to cure cancer, because cancer is a natural process. It would be wrong to, if we could reverse the aging process, it would be wrong to do so, because aging is natural. In fact, pretty much everything that we want medicine to do for us involves interrupting a natural process. So that is not a real rule, and so it cannot apply to medicine, it cannot apply to aging, it can't apply to cancer, and so it doesn't apply to abortion either. Not a good rule. So if someone offers a rule, as if this is a moral rule, and you say, well, it's broken over here, well, that's okay. You don't have to, it only applies over here. There's no such thing as a logical or moral rule that only applies when I want it to and doesn't apply where I don't want it to. Rules are universal. So did that make sense? Mm-hmm. Right. That's one of the fundamental things. Right. Which leads on to the next rule, the rule of contradictions. Oh no. I'm going the wrong way, aren't I? These count down. Oh God, I do such silly things sometimes. How many of you noticed I was going the wrong way? Well, you should have said something. I'm not here. Or did you have a bet going for how long it would take me to notice? I bet he doesn't notice before the end of class. Right? You watch, I'll do it again. I'll forget. So 19 should be rule of universals. 18 is the rule of contradictions. All right. The rule of contradictions, sort of special case of the rule, the rule of universality. The rules of logic are universal. But it's right. Look at it this way. Suppose you're reading a novel, and let's say it's about vampires, and early in the novel, the writer insists that vampires cannot ever survive being exposed to sunlight. And then 3/4 of the way through the novel, you have a character who's walking around in sunlight, who's a vampire, with no explanation. And you're like, now, if that's a contradiction, right? You say things are one way at one point, and then they're another way at the other point. Right? But that doesn't matter so much because that's fiction, right? If it's fiction, you know, as long as you're enjoying the novel, it's a plot hole, I don't care. I'm enjoying the fight scenes or whatever, you know, because it's the kind of stuff that drives me crazy, right? But if someone's giving an extended argument, and at the beginning of the argument they said, nothing can exist without a cause. And then later in the argument they say, this thing can exist without a cause. It's like, no, you started the argument by saying nothing can exist without a cause. And you've got to follow that rule all the way through your argument. Right? If you're doing a different argument for a different thing, you can use different rules. That's okay. One of them would be wrong, but we wouldn't necessarily know which one. But if you're making an extended argument with lots of premises and sub-arguments that stack on each other, if one of the things the argument stands on is that nothing can exist without a cause, and the other thing is that here's something that exists without a cause, you contradicted yourself in the same argument. They can't both be true. And you need both of them to be true for the argument to work. And for that, the other way around. You need both of them to be true for the argument to work. They can't both be true because they contradict each other. One of them is false, and if even one of them is false, your argument fails. So the argument fails. Did that make sense? So if someone contradicts himself inside one argument, now it's okay if someone contradicts himself in two different arguments. If I'm talking about, well, it's kind of okay. If I'm talking about intelligent design today and I make a rule and say nothing can exist without a cause, and then 2 weeks later I'm talking about Big Bang Theory and I say something can exist without a cause, you can say, hey, you know, 2 weeks ago when you were talking about something else, you said that nothing could exist without a cause. And I go, oh yeah, you're right. I'm contradicting myself. So one of these must be wrong. I must be wrong about one of them. I don't know which. Right. So that's not great, and it's kind of bad. But it's not necessarily fatal to either argument. We just had to figure out whether things can exist without causes or not, or whether we could know that. Did that bit make sense? Yeah. So the next one. Right, this would be 17. That's going to be green. Another way of putting this rule is to say, never get a description of an argument from its opponents. Never get the argument for a doctrine from the doctrine's opponents. For instance, as you may have noticed, I think that intelligent design is complete and utter rubbish, perhaps at a criminal level. So if you were interested in the topic of intelligent design, I would not be the first person you would go to get the argument for intelligent design. And the reason is, even if I'm completely honest and thoughtful and fair, I might still be getting the argument wrong. I might be committing what was called the straw man fallacy. So if you want to investigate intelligent design, you go to the leading proponents of intelligent design, or a number of people who believe in intelligent design, who think it's a good thing, who think it's right, and get their arguments, get the arguments from them. You might come to me later and ask me for my opinion and what I think and stuff, and then maybe they don't explain their arguments very well, and you have to think about it and make the write the argument out in a way that makes it as strong as possible. You may have to do some work, but you're more likely to get the right version of their argument from them than you are from me, simply because I think intelligent design is wrong. And sometimes it's the case that people who are against a view just don't explain it correctly. If you want to understand evolution through natural selection, stay away from the Creation Institute, because they probably don't understand it. Get it from an evolutionary biologist. Get it from Francisco Ayala down at UCI, or someone who teaches biology, not someone who spends their time trying to attack the theory, because there's a risk that they would describe it wrongly. And when someone describes an argument wrongly and then attacks that wrong version of the argument, they're not attacking the argument. And this is what the straw man fallacy is. If I wanted to make you think that a particular doctrine, and I wanted something other than intelligent design, say I'm against, well, let's say I'm against the stand your ground law over there in Florida or several states. Say I'm against the stand your ground laws, and I want to convince you to oppose stand your ground laws. And then say, I give you the argument for stand your ground. But I don't give you the same argument that its proponents give you. I give you a weaker argument. So I make up an argument that's not a good argument for stand your ground, and then I write it out on the board, and I say, here's the argument for stand your ground, and then I show you how it's weak. Have I really refuted stand your ground? No, I faked it. Because if I don't give you the right argument, whatever I say about the wrong argument is irrelevant to that right argument. Does that make sense? Right, so you watch out. In philosophy, it occasionally happens that when two people are arguing, one of them will say, well, his argument is this, blah, 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 blah. And then you look at what the other guy said, and it's not that, it's something different. It's something different and stronger. And I've had this happen quite a few times. In fact, in our text, there's this reference to a doctrine called soft determinism. Right? Soft determinism is a composite doctrine. It believes two things. Real free will exists. Free will. You guys know what free will is? If you get up and leave the class because you decided that I am so boring that you cannot stand to listen to me anymore, and nobody made you leave, that's you leaving of your own free will. If Ninja dropped from the ceiling and dragged you out of the classroom, that's you leaving not of your own free will. And and if someone or if someone runs in with or in a bank, right? If someone comes in and says, well, I don't have an account here and I don't actually have any money, but I kind of want a lot of money, so could you give me $10,000? And you give him, and the teller gives him $10,000 because he feels like it, that's handing over the money of his own free will. But if the guy comes up in with an AK-47, puts a bunch of holes in the roof and says, I'll kill you if you don't give me the money, and the teller hands over the money because they're afraid of getting shot, that's not free will. That's coercion. That's under coercion. So if you do something because you were threatened that you would be hurt if you didn't do it, that is not a free-willed action. Does this make sense? Does this reflect your understanding of free will? Right? Soft determinism says that exists. And determinism is true. Determinism is the idea that things can be caused. If you buy an ice cream because you wanted to buy an ice cream, that's your mental state determining what you do. That's determinism. If you go into Cold Stone intending to buy an ice cream, after deciding to buy an ice cream, you want to buy an ice cream, nothing happens to change your mind. And it's important, your mind is not changed by anything. You want an ice cream. You've decided to get an ice cream. Your mind pushes you towards getting ice cream. But instead you slap the person behind the counter. For no reason whatsoever. That is indeterminism, lack of determinism, because your needs, desires, and decisions and volitions did not determine what you did. Self-determinism says free will exists and determinism is true. That is, determinism is true, the universe operates predominantly or exclusively deterministic. Maybe there's some indeterminism down there in quantum mechanics. We don't actually really know. And sometimes people determine their own actions. You determine when you leave the classroom because you want to leave the classroom. That's you determining that you leave. Does that make sense? Right, so this is the doctrine of self-determinism. In our textbook, the writer of our textbook gives a completely different definition of free will and says that that's what self-determinism thinks. So in the textbook, in our textbook, by Donald Palmer, which is really a very good textbook, mostly. In fact, it's one of the best textbooks out there because it's got pictures. It says that self-determinists believe that free will is different from you determining your desires. It's determining what you do. It's the coincidence of action and desire. And I'm reading that and I'm like, I've never heard that. I've never heard anybody who's a self-determinist say that free will is this coincidence of will, of action and desire. Right? Never heard that. It's always been people determining for themselves what they do. And I don't understand it. I used to have people read it, and it was just too annoying to deal with. And now it's like, it's in there as a essay topic. I don't have people read it because it's just so wrong. So if there's a doctrine that is misdescribed in the textbook or on the whiteboard, say I have, right, there's this other doctrine called libertarianism. Which says that you determine what people determine, sometimes determine what they do, and nothing is ever determined by anything. If I describe that wrongly, nothing I say about it will matter. So when we come to talking about libertarianism, something to think about is Dr. Young correctly describing this doctrine? Right. So, and Nobody owns philosophy. There's no Pope of philosophy. I'm not the Pope of philosophy. That's why I don't wear the big, I don't have a big white pointy hat. Right? So I don't own philosophy. I don't get to be the final authority. Let me put it this way. If you ask me a question, why is this? I'm supposed to give you a reason. And that's what I will always do. I'll say, well, I think that this is for this. Or I'll say, I don't know. Or it's like, I think I know, but I can't really give you a good answer right now. Right? For instance, if you ask me, why is there morality? I would say, well, I think I've got some kind of answer for you, but I would really have to, it would be really complicated, and I'd have to work it out, and I'm not entirely sure that I can really prove that morality actually exists. I'm not going to say because I say so. It just does. Right? That's against the rules. You can't say something just is true. Everyone's always entitled to... I had an internet argument with a guy who said, well, I just am an expert on Christianity. Anything I say about Christianity is going to be true. And I say, well, why? What's your qualification? Oh, no, I just am. I had such fun with him. It's like, he would get so mad. But, yeah. But he wouldn't stop, so I had to quit because I got tired of it. So he probably thought he won the argument. By the way, you can never win an argument on the internet. Okay, so there's the straw man rule, is you can't misdescribe, you can't misdescribe the other side's argument. You've got to get it right. Because if you don't get the other side's argument right, nothing you say about them is going to be right. All right. Okay, this is a kind of quirky one. The rule of names.
You wrote 18 again.
I wrote 18 again. You right? I did it right away. But watch. That doesn't look right. That's the wrong side. How do you draw a 6? Oh no, it's just... Wow, things I forget. My spelling errors are always unique. They're just, it's like, no, nobody ever spells, cabbage with 3 I's. That I do. Okay, so the rule of names. Has anybody here ever heard of a fellow called Jacques Derrida? Good, because he's complete rubbish. If you go through academia, if you go any further, rise in academia, if you become a professor, eventually you will hear something called deconstruction, and you'll hear the name Derrida, and you will run into somebody who raves about what a genius Jacques Derrida is and how wonderful he is, and it'll all be nonsense. It will all be complete nonsense. It's an intellectual fad that has dominated and wrecked English departments all over the continent. It may be fading. I hope it's fading out, but there are these idiots out called deconstructionists. And I realized that Jacques Derrida was a complete idiot when I read a speech that he'd given at an international philosophy conference. And he said, look, here I am giving the keynote address at an international philosophy conference. And this is a problem because there's an inherent contradiction in having an international philosophy conference, because it implies that there's such a thing as a national philosophy. And I read that and I'm like, no it doesn't. It's just a name. What is implied by the term International Philosophy Conference? Well, it's a conference. It has people in there who do philosophy, so it's about philosophy, right? It's not a convention of plumbers, right? And what does the international bit mean? It means there's philosophers there from different countries. Somebody had to do air travel to get there. That's what an international philosophy conference means. It doesn't mean, oh, we all have national philosophies, because we don't. So why is it called an international philosophy conference? Because people come there from different countries. So the organizers wanted to make it sound exciting. International philosophy. I was at an international philosophy conference. Right. The two countries were the United States and Mexico, and it was held in Tijuana. But it was an international. I had to cross a national border to get there. Right. That makes it international. That's all it means. And I'd looked at Derrida's work, and every bit of Derrida's work I've ever seen is like him taking the name of something and reading into it more than is there. And it's like, dude, names are just names. You know, like, I don't know. It's like advertising. It doesn't mean anything. We just give things a name. By the way, how are things related to words? How are words related to things? Is it the case that we have a set of words to start with, and then we look around for things, we invent things to go with the words? Or do we invent things and then come up with a word for it later? Do we think up, you know, or if you think, do we think up things and then name them, or do we have names and then we have to come up with a thing for the name? Say again?
Make things first.
You will make things first, right? Things usually get different names later on too. There's the case, you know, the original name. Right, we invented this sort of remote viewing device, and what did we call it? Television. Right? And sometimes, you know, they come up with names and stuff. You ever see the show Mad Men? It's about advertising executives, and they have this. They're talking about this slide projector. This is back in the '60s when, you know, photographic slides were a big thing. And they had this device that this company had made, Kodak had made, that you would click and it'd show a new slide, right? It had this round thing around it on the top that would go around to hold all the slides, and you'd click and it would pick up the current slide and put down the next slide, and it, you know, move along. Ka-chick, ka-chick, ka-chick. Is anyone besides me old enough to remember actually hearing this done? No, God, I'm so old. Right. Anyway, so this primitive technology from before any of you were born, right? And this thing, and I can't remember the code. And they say this is called the carriage or the carrier, right? Or something like that. It's a really bland name. Call it. And the advertising executive, the copywriter says, "Oh, that's no good. We'll call it a carousel." And from then on, it was called a carousel, right? Names of things change. I mean. Right? I mean, if I was in the audience for Derrida's speech, I'd say, well, how about instead of calling it an international philosophy conference, we call it Seymour. Here we are at Seymour. Right? Does that imply we're going to be eaten by a carnivorous plant? Okay, over everybody's head. Little Shop of Horrors, guys. Rent it. Download it. Little Shop of Horrors. I guarantee you'll get the joke. Halfway through, you go, oh, that's what he was talking about. Yeah. I don't work for my jokes. I make you work. Well, not that I can. All right, so names are just names. And if somebody makes an argument based on the name of something, dude, we can change it to Irving or Fred or my imagination's not working very well. I'm tired. So... call it the magic pixie. I'll just make up a word. So, rule of names. 15. Down. Concepts. All right, this is kind of a tricky one, I guess. the way we think about things is not necessarily the way things are. Another way to think of that is that this is the relationship between theory and reality. If someone has a theory about reality that's not supported by the evidence, does that mean that the evidence is wrong? You know, your evidence contradicts my theory, so your evidence must be wrong? Does that work that way? Now, what happens when theories are contradicted by evidence? We throw out the theory. Right, that's what we do. So the way we think about something does not determine what it is. So,
I hate to interrupt, but can I interrupt you just for a second?
Please don't. It's a class.
I understand that. We have a gentleman that believes that someone that his phone is in here. Is it possible that someone picked up a phone by mistake?
Has anyone here picked up a phone? Did anyone here see a phone when they came in?
It was right out here.
No.
Okay, I'm very sorry for the interruption. Thank you very much.
Right, so... later in the semester we will see an argument made by René Descartes that says, well, the way I think about mind is this. This is my concept of mind, and here's my concept of body. Look, they have nothing in common. Therefore, mind and body have nothing in common. One of the things about philosophy, by the way, is that philosophy developed its conceptual apparatus over time. The idea that there's a difference between a concept and an object, right, between an object and our concept of that object, the way we think about the object, is relatively new. Descartes didn't know about it. The idea that there's deductive logic and inductive logic, Descartes didn't know about that. That's a relatively new idea. It's about 200 years old. So we're going to see people back, and actually for next week I'm going to have you read the Theaetetus and the Meno to look at, and in the Meno you will look at an ancient argument for the existence of the soul, of innate ideas, which are ideas that come pre-loaded in the soul before you are born, and on immortality. And that argument will be, well, actually I'm going to let you try and figure out for yourself how good an argument that is. But it's not generally accepted nowadays. Let's put it that way. And you see how they reasoned back then, how Socrates reasoned in this dialogue. And you know, we love Socrates. Philosophers love Socrates. We think he was great, but he was pretty much the first person to think about this stuff. So he didn't necessarily do it very well by our standards. Did that make sense? So. I don't want to be just mocking Descartes, because Descartes was a genius. All right. Okay. Fix that. All right. Here's the next one. The rule of experience. Sometimes people get confused between theory and data. And there's an argument we will deal with later in the semester, where someone gets confused between theory and data. Right. And what I mean by this is we have experiences and we have theories that we use to account for those experiences. So I want you to imagine that we're outside, it's a clear, dark night, right? And we've got an unobstructed view of the sky, and we can see two little red dots out there. There's a lot of other dots, all right, that are white, maybe a little blue-green out there, but mostly more or less white. And I point to one of these dots and say that's Mars. And I point to another one and I say that's Beetlejuice. Mars, Beetlejuice, right? Now tell me the difference between Mars and Beetlejuice as you understand them, as you would see what differences you would see apart from different location, what differences you would see on a dark night out observing the stars. Would you see any differences? And the answer is no, right? The experience of seeing Beetlejuice is pretty much it's the same as the experience of seeing Mars. Maybe Mars will be brighter in the sky some time of year. There'll be slight differences, and it'll be pretty hard. You know, if I look up and I see a red dot in the sky, I'm going to have to look around a bit and think a bit before I can figure out whether it's Mars or Beetlejuice. Mars or Beetlejuice, right? I can't tell the difference. If I'm seeing them through a gap in the cloud, and that's the only star I can see, I'm pretty much lost. Okay, so the experience of seeing Mars is seeing a little red dot in the sky. Experience of seeing Beetlejuice is seeing a little red dot in the sky. That's the experience part of this. Right. What's the theory part? What is our theory for this red dot? If you study astronomy, you look it up on Wikipedia, what would be the theory that would be given to explain this? Our beliefs about Mars. Tall rock, thin atmosphere. Right, it's got a thin atmosphere, but it's basically a ball of rock. What color is the rock? Red. Right. How does Mars shine? Where's that light? Why is it bright?
The reflection
Gnomes. What?
The reflection of the sun.
Yes, reflection of the sun. Reflected light. And in cosmic terms, it's pretty close. In the solar system, the orbit of Mars is just outside the orbit of the Earth, but it's you know, so it comes pretty close, and sometimes it's on the other side of the sun, so you can't see it pretty much. But it's pretty close cosmically. It's always closer to us than Jupiter is. Jupiter's really far out, and Jupiter's never closer than Mars. But it's sometimes brighter than Mars because it's bigger, right? And it can. I think so. Reflected light, pretty close. What is Beetlejuice made of, roughly?
Gas?
Yeah.
Gas, right. Beetlejuice is big enough that if Beetlejuice suddenly replaced our sun, we would be inside Beetlejuice. Mars would be inside Beetlejuice. All the asteroid belt would be inside Beetlejuice, and Jupiter would be pretty close. It would be either just in or just out. Right. Beetlejuice is huge compared to Mars, compared to our sun. It's massive. It's rocketing through, well, not rocketing, but it's hurtling through space at an enormous speed. It's anomalous. It's not really moving with the rest of the galaxy. It's sort of zipping through. We can't tell because it's so far away. No, not really. You know, it's got an atmosphere, but it's an atmosphere of superheated hydrogen, like a solar corona. Is it shining by reflected light? No, it's incandescent. And it's pretty far away compared to Mars. It's not far away compared to the galactic center or the M31 in Andromeda or like that. But it's, you know, it's hell a long way away compared to the stuff in our solar system. Right. Now, when you look in the night sky, are you seeing a big ball of gas? Does it look like gas? Does it look like it's shining with its own light rather than being reflected? No. Does it look far away? Does it look like it's further away than Mars? No, because the way the sun, because the distances, when you go out and you look at the night sky, everything, everything seems the same distance away. Right? All the stars seem like they're the same distance away, except in our theory of the stars says that some of them are billions of times further away than others. Beetlejuice is actually a fairly close star, as stars go. And that exhausts my astronomical knowledge. That's everything. You now know everything I know about astronomy. Right, so you have to make, in this in our text, there's a description of a philosopher who does not really distinguish between seeing Mars in the night sky and seeing a big ball of rock. Right? When you're looking at everything that's true, it's not. Because experience is different from theory. What happens to us, what we experience, what we can do, is different from the theories we deploy to explain it. I'll give you another example. When you see a glass of water, do you say, aha, look at all that hydrogen and oxygen. Look at all those tetrahedral molecules with two weak positive and two weak negative poles. Does anyone here know that the water molecule is tetrahedral? Does anyone here know what tetrahedral means?
Four-sided.
Yes, four-sided. A four-sided solid. Right. Okay, so I'm going to do the next rule. Why not? What the hell is this? I think something weird happened. Okay. 13, that was going to be a 5. But right. Now, I talked about the essay prompts, right? I talked about defining your terms, and that's often quite an important thing in a philosophy paper or any kind of paper. You don't always have to define your terms, but sometimes you do. Sometimes it's vitally important. And if anybody takes on the topic of psychological egoism, I'm going to insist, you know what psychological ego is? Have you ever heard someone say, well, everyone is basically selfish? Human beings are all fundamentally selfish. That's psychological egoism. It says that we're egoists and it's part of our psychology. That we're built that way. And it's actually what we call pseudoscience, because it sounds like a scientific theory. It makes the kind of claim that science makes, but it's not really science. It's not based on evidence. So if any of you decide you want to work on the topic of psychological egoism, and because a lot of people have done so, there's a lot of help for that in the papers I've written. I'm going to insist, though, that you start off by defining self-interest. What does it mean that for someone to act in their own self-interest? If you define self-interest as whatever someone feels like doing, right, or whatever anyone decides to do, and you say, well, when they can, people always do what they decide to do, as psychological ego. And I say, well, that's not really an interesting thing to say. Yes, people do what they decide to do. When does anybody who do something he didn't decide to do? I'm not going to pick up the bottle. I have decided not to pick up the bottle. Do you believe that I decided not to pick up the bottle and then magically did something I hadn't decided to do? Does anyone believe that I had not decided to pick up the bottle and was lying about it? No, everybody does what they decide to do. Everybody acts to get a feeling of satisfaction from doing what they decided to do. That's a kind of trivial thing. So if that's your definition of self-interest, pick another topic, because that's really not an interesting thesis. If your definition of self-interest is money and power, which is the usual definition of self-interest, right? If I'm acting in my self-interest, I'm acting to have more money than I otherwise would, right? Someone who acts in their own self-interest will always, if someone is an egoist, right, the word egoist, they're always out for them. Have you ever known people like that? Oh good, you're lucky. You know, when people are egoists, they'll screw anybody over to get what they want, right? And they don't care who they hurt. That's what egoism is. And someone's an egoist, they will calculate what action will bring them the best return over the long run, right? Right. So they'll make friends. You see brown nosing, when people make friends with someone who can promote them, right? Rather than making friends with people they like. When people flatter, sucking up, that kind of thing, because they'll suck up to someone. Oh, I'll pretend to be awake during this lecture so that the professor will give me a good grade. Right. So people acting, people who, I don't know. I can't think of anything. But think of it this way. So there's a drowning child, and the child, it turns out, and there's a guy, and he hears a child is drowning and says, I don't want to get my feet wet, and I just got my cappuccino. If I go save the child, I'll be soaking wet, and my cappuccino will get cold, and then I'll have to, run to catch the movie. I will have an uncomfortable 5 minutes instead of a nice, nice relaxed coffee. And it says, oh, but that's the child of a millionaire. Oh, a millionaire? I'll save that child. And the millionaire will probably be grateful. Egoism, the doctrine of psychological egoism, says everyone's like that. I'll get it because it'll give me fame, or I'll get money, or something that's an interest. So if you write about psychological egoism, particularly if you defend it, I want you to define self-interest right up front. What defines an act that's in someone's self-interest? An act that gives them a lot of pleasure, an act that gives them money or power or things that lead to pleasure. Right? And once you've done that, you cannot change that definition as you go in the paper. Because what happens again and again in papers on psychological egoism is that people say, well, this fellow acted to save the child of poor parents who weren't even going to thank him, and his cappuccino got cold, but he still did it. But he did it for a feeling of satisfaction of having done it. And I'm going to say, well, that's not what you said self-interest was. And anyway, if that's what self-interest is, the guy who let the kid drown acted against his self-interest because he could have had that feeling of satisfaction. Is this making sense? This is all about, the same rules apply everywhere. It goes back to the rule of universality, that the same rules. You can't change the definition, your definition of something, in the middle of your paper, in the middle of your argument. All right. If you find out that you can't sustain the original definition, change your mind. It's the thinking process. Okay, I see a lot of unhappy faces. Damn, and I've got to make a sharp turn on the way to the exit. No, is this making sense? Okay, maybe it'll make sense later. I'll try another one. Does anyone have any questions so far? The rule of words. I'll squeeze it in here. 12 words. All right. Words mean things. Generally speaking, the rule is different word, different thing. If a writer uses two different words to mean the same thing, that's bad, because the reader will go, here you say randomness, but here you say indeterminism. Are they the same thing? And it's going to be ambiguous, right? And you have to read the person very carefully and try to figure out what they're saying. And sometimes you can't figure out what they're saying. So in your papers, when you write your papers, don't use two words to mean the same thing. Does that seem simple? Right, that's right. Now, I'm going to try not to use two words or two terms to mean the same thing. So if I use two different words, unless I'm referring to somebody else who's, I'm talking about somebody else's work. If I use two different words, it's generally going to be two different things. For instance, or two different terms. Do you know what a term is? Soft determinism is a term. Right, when you combine these two words, you get the name of a thing. And it's not the same as being soft, and it's not the same as determinism. Soft determinism does not mean the same thing as determinism. And it does not mean the same as hard determinism. Now, you don't know what any of these terms mean right now, but you do know that they mean different things. So there's the names of three different doctrines there. Soft determinism, determinism, hard determinism. And when you're writing, don't use these interchangeably. One that I've seen a couple of times is confusing psychological egoism with egoism. Again, the term psychological egoism does not mean the same thing as egoism. And it does not mean, which does not mean the same thing as moral egoism. And of course, moral egoism does not mean the same thing as psychological egoism. I can tell you what these are. Egoism is being completely selfish, completely and utterly selfish. Never any a thought for anyone else. Everything that's done is done entirely for one's own self-interest. Psychological egoism is a doctrine that everyone is like that. And so there's something added. Everyone's like that. This is being like that. This is saying everyone's like that. Moral egoism is the idea that you should be like that. It's morally wrong to not be like that. Moral egoism is a weird doctrine. I think it's ludicrous, but it's out there. So, is this making sense? Different term, different... Yes,
it's
sir.
just applying to terms,
Yeah.
words in general.
Well, okay, in the English language, there are very few, if any, exact synonyms. Generally speaking, in English, two different words will mean different things. The word randomness and the word indeterminism actually mean different things in English. Something can be random without being indeterminate, because we use the word random to mean an uncontrolled choice process that isn't necessarily an indeterminate choice process. I'm going to go over this again at the end of the semester when we talk about free will and determinism, but we'll have covered a lot more technical language by then, and it'll be easy. And I'll go over it more slowly. Anybody ever heard the word aerodrome? It's an old word for an airfield. For a while, airfield and aerodrome were used interchangeably, but people got tired of one word and they just settled on airfield. The other word dropped out of use. In English, exact synonyms tend to drop out of use. There are always shades of meanings because there'll be some situation where you don't want to use the word that's almost a synonym. In philosophy, but there's something, in the book, the writer of the book uses the word randomness to be an exact synonym of indeterminism. And that kind of annoys me because it's not really clear what kind of randomness is meant. And why have two words for the same thing? That even if it... Does that make sense to you, that we shouldn't have two words for the same thing? If we're going to speak technically? This is, okay, so there's the rule of words. Rule of repetition. I made this, some of these rules just come from mistakes I've seen students make. And then maybe like one student a year, one student out of 200 or 300 people, no, actually no, one student out of 150 people. All right, I might have 150, 200 students a year, and I'll get one student who does this. But when it happens, it really sticks in my mind, and I want to point it out as an error. And you may run into someone who does the same thing. So the rule of repetition. I had a student once who basically insisted that psychological egoism was true because people always act in their own self-interest. Do you see the flaw in that logic? Well, she believes that people always act in their own self-interest, which makes psychological egoism true. The trouble is, psychological egoism is just a name for the doctrine that people always act in their own self-interest. So if I say psychological egoism is true, that's just another way of saying people always act in their own self-interest. So if someone was to argue, well, I'm going to say psychological egoism is true. Okay, why? Well, because people always act in their own self-interest. You just said that. I want to know why you think that. No, that's the reason. No, it's not. You're saying the same thing twice in different words. So why, can you give me a reason to think that people always act in their own self-interest? Well, because whenever someone acts, it's because it's in their own interest. They chose that action because it's in their own self-interest. And I know you think that. But can you give me a reason to support that idea, that claim? I've never had anyone come up with a reason, by the way, for psychological egoism. It's always, there's two things. One is just repetition, and the other is, or changing the definition of self-interest. And then there's, well, you can't prove it's not true. Well, yeah, I can. I mean, there are people who do altruistic actions. A lot of people do charitable work. Oh, they're really in there. That's really for their self-interest. Yeah, that's what you've got to prove, dude. You can't assume it. Right. If someone's going to make a sweeping... If I wanted to say, well, I don't believe this, but if I wanted to argue that everyone is really altruistic and everyone at heart wants other people to be happy and is willing to sacrifice their own time and effort for it, I'd have to come up with evidence, wouldn't I? Well, I would, right? So merely repeating the same thing in different words is not an argument. So let's look at. Right. Which leads on to the 10 rule of evidence. Right. If I'm going to say something is true, I have to support that claim with evidence. If I'm going to say something's true in the world, I have to come up with evidence. I have to come up with evidence, something that can only be properly explained by appeal to my claim. The properties of chemical compounds are evidence for atomic theory, because atomic theory predicts those properties. The properties of elements are evidence for physics. If someone wants to say something exists, they have to come up with evidence for it existing. Otherwise, we're entitled to ignore the... it's okay for them to believe things. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. People can have faith-based beliefs. They just can't say that we should believe or that other people should believe what they believe unless they can come up with reasons. Right? So there's this thing about sort of like two universes of discourse. There's the universe of rational discourse, where everything is rationally supported. You can say, okay, this is likely to be true because it's a good argument. We've got actual truth and actual falsity. And then there's the universe of just belief, opinion, where anybody can believe anything. And that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with people having beliefs that are chosen. So they believe what they believe merely because they choose to believe it, because it makes them feel good, or they feel that it's true. The kicker comes in if they have a feeling that somebody else is evil and needs to be punished. That's not on. You can't be, well, I just have a faith-based belief that you're a serial killer, so I'm entitled to kill you. That doesn't work. Does it? Oh, good. All right. So, getting the ones that are kind of easier. 9 insults. Rule of insults actually it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's sort of a red flag kind of thing. If you read, well, let me put it this way: if you're reading my work and I'm talking about some other philosopher, when I'm talking about Derrida, remember I said Derrida is rubbish? That's kind of an insult. If I said he's an idiot, which I think I did, well, he's an idiot, right? That's an opinion of mine. If I was to write, and you'd ask me, well, Dr. Young, what is really wrong with Derrida? And I was to write a serious paper criticizing Derrida. And you read this serious paper criticizing Derrida, this argument that Derrida's theory, whatever it is wrong, and it's full of insults. That's a big red flag, because insults don't prove anything. Right? If you just read, oh, he's stupid, he doesn't think, he's blustering, he doesn't understand anything. Right? If I'm making a bunch of accusations and characterizations, and that's a red flag, because people typically don't throw out insults when they've got arguments. So you're entitled to be annoyed at me because I'm wasting your time with these insults. And if you want to take my paper seriously, you have to dig through and ignore the insults and look for actual argument. And if there is no actual argument, if the only thing there is me insulting Derrida, then you're entitled to say, well, this paper's not worth anything. Right? Because insults can certainly not substitute for argument. Does that make sense? Okay, that's supposed to be. So, all right. All right. I'm an atheist, and the way I usually define that is to say I'm a member of whatever religion is being attacked at the moment. And this is what goes into the rule of sympathy. If anyone's entitled to defend their own religion, to say, I believe this, and this is why I believe it, this is my tradition, whatever you want to say, and you're entitled. what gets my back up is when somebody points to somebody else's religion. So that religion is terrible, that religion is awful, they do this and this and this. And when that happens, my instinct is to say, no. And I would get up and look at the situation and say, no, you're wrong, they don't do that, they don't sacrifice children to Moloch or whatever it is you're saying, you know. They don't drive, their religion doesn't say they have to drive on the wrong side of the road, or whatever the criticism. I would tend to try to defend whatever religion is under attack. Because, right, it sometimes happens that doctrines that are correct are not well defended. And if you see a doctrine being badly attacked, the rule of sympathy says, well, you know, at least don't join in the attack. Reasoned criticism is fine, but you know, attacks, no. All right, the last rule is actually an important one, and I'm going to get that 7th. Charity. The rule of charity says that if I can interpret you as saying something stupid, or equally reasonably interpret you as saying something smart, I should interpret you as saying something smart. Right? If I write something on the board and you could take it 2 ways, take it the smart way. If you read a piece of text, look at an article, and it could go 2 ways, take it the smart way. Because that's probably what was meant, and even if it wasn't what was meant, the doctrine might, you know, support it. So to be charitable, don't make anybody's ideas out to be dumber than they strictly need to be. Especially when you're writing your paper and you're writing about the other side. Don't make them look dumber than they actually are, and if they're ambiguous, choose the smarter, stronger side. Okay, thank you all very much for your attention. You are free to go.